My name is Cassandra, and I will never forget the night my father smirked across the dinner table and told me, in front of everyone, "You're not getting anything." The words didn't come out as a casual comment. They were sharpened, deliberate, designed to sting. And they did. For a moment, I felt the air catch in my throat as if someone had pressed a knife against it. Before I continue, please subscribe to show karma you're on the right side. Anyways, the evening had started like so many others. An elaborate meal in the dining room of my parents' home, the kind of place where the chandelier sparkled a little too brightly, as if trying to blind you into forgetting the tension underneath. My siblings were there, sitting straighter than usual, as though they wanted to impress him even at their age. My mother busied herself with passing dishes, avoiding eye contact like she always did when she sensed his cruelty about to surface. I had come with no expectations, only a desire to get through the evening without confrontation. But my father had other plans. He waited until the conversation lulled, as though he had rehearsed the timing. He leaned back in his chair, glass of wine in hand, eyes scanning the table like a man surveying territory he believed he owned. Then he looked at me. His lips curled into that smug smile I had known since childhood, the one that always preceded some kind of humiliation. "You know, Cassandra," he said, his voice carrying just enough for every ear at the table to catch it. "When the time comes, you're not getting anything. I don't want you thinking you'll inherit a dime." The words dropped into the silence like a stone into water, sending ripples across the table. My brother shifted uncomfortably, pretending to cut into his steak. My sister raised her eyebrows, not with surprise, but with the satisfaction of someone who felt confirmed in her place as the favorite. My mother's hand trembled slightly as she set down her fork. For a brief second, I felt the old familiar ache of being the outsider, the one constantly measured and found lacking. Childhood memories of being told I wasn't good enough, smart enough, obedient enough came flooding back. His words weren't just about money. They were about belonging, about power, about his ability to strip me of worth in front of everyone else. But something was different this time. The sting was there, yes, but beneath it ran a current of something else, something steady and unshakable. He didn't know, and no one else at that table knew, but his words carried no real weight anymore. I had already built a life beyond his reach, yet still I stayed quiet, letting the moment stretch, letting them believe I was wounded. He smirked again, clearly satisfied with the impact he thought he'd made. The meal continued awkwardly, but the words hung heavy in the air like smoke that refused to clear. And though I didn't speak them aloud, I was laughing inside, because while he believed he had stripped me of something, the truth was I had already surpassed him in ways he couldn't imagine. Growing up, I was always the one measured against a scale I could never reach. My father made sure of it. From the time I was a little girl, he made comparisons a daily ritual, as if reminding me where I stood in the family hierarchy was part of his job. My brother was the golden child, the one who inherited his brilliance. My sister was the darling, praised endlessly for her charm and looks. And me? I was the reminder of what not to be. I can still hear his voice echoing through the years, sharp and matter-of-fact. "Why can't you be more like your brother? He knows how to make me proud." Or, "Look at your sister, she knows how to win people over. You, on the other hand, always think too much." It didn't matter what I did. Straight A's in school were brushed off as expected, while my brother's average grades were celebrated like triumphs. Any small mistake I made was magnified, replayed, and tied to the narrative that I was somehow less than. Family dinners became stages where the script never changed. My father would ask my siblings about their accomplishments, nodding with approval, his eyes shining as if their successes were his own. When it came to me, his tone shifted. Questions were laced with doubt, his responses flat, dismissive. If I mentioned something I was proud of, a scholarship, a project, even just a hobby, I'd be met with that same smirk, the one that said, "It doesn't matter." Sometimes he didn't even bother to respond. He'd move on, changing the subject as though I hadn't spoken at all. The silence was worse than criticism. It was erasure. The rivalry it created among us wasn't natural. My siblings weren't cruel by nature, but they absorbed the dynamic he set. My brother took on the role of the confident heir, strutting through life as though he already had the family fortune in his pocket. My sister perfected her role as the favorite, leaning into the adoration and rarely questioning its cost. And me? I was left in the shadows, carrying the weight of knowing that no matter how hard I tried, I would never be enough in his eyes. The emotional weight of that rejection followed me everywhere. It wasn't just about being left out of conversations or dismissed at the table. It was about the constant reminder that my father's love, his approval, was conditional. And for me, those conditions were impossible to meet. I grew up believing I had to fight for scraps of validation, believing that my worth was always on trial. His favoritism wasn't just preference. It was a message that shaped the way I saw myself for years, that I was destined to be the lesser one. So when he looked across the table years later and told me I wasn't getting anything, it wasn't new. It was just the culmination of a lifetime of words and smirks that told me the same thing. In his eyes, I had never been worthy of receiving anything at all. The room seemed to still when he said it, as if even the clinking of silverware and the low hum of conversation knew to pause for his words. My father leaned back in his chair, swirling the wine in his glass like a man who owned the world, and fixed his eyes on me. That smirk spread across his face, slow, deliberate, the kind of expression that carried more weight than the words themselves. Then came the sentence that was meant to cut through me like a blade. "You're not getting anything." It wasn't loud or dramatic. He didn't need to raise his voice. The smirk did most of the work. He wanted me to feel small, to shrink under the gaze of my siblings and the heavy silence that followed. For him, this was the grand performance, a way to remind me and everyone else at that table who held the power. He believed that power was money, inheritance, status. He believed that by dangling, or in this case, ripping away, the prospect of wealth, he could define my place forever. I looked around the table. My brother avoided my eyes, shifting uncomfortably in his seat, though I could sense the smug satisfaction radiating from him. My sister tilted her head with that subtle expression that said she wasn't surprised. My mother's hands trembled as she set her glass down, her silence the same shield she had carried through decades of moments just like this. In years past, I might have felt crushed. I might have stared at my plate, swallowing the ache in my throat, convincing myself that he was right, that my future depended on crumbs from his table. But not this time. This time, something broke. Not in me, but in the illusion he had worked so hard to maintain. I sat still, lips pressed into a faint smile, heart steady, and something inside me laughed. Not out of spite, not out of arrogance, but out of the sheer irony of it all. He thought he was holding the sword over me, when in truth the blade had long since dulled. He thought I needed him, that my value was tethered to the fortune he controlled, when in reality, I had already built something far greater, something he couldn't touch. He believed he had delivered the final blow, but what he didn't know was that his words had no power left. My silence wasn't weakness, it was strength. It was the quiet laughter of someone who had surpassed every limit he tried to impose. I didn't need to defend myself, didn't need to argue, didn't need to expose the truth in that moment. The truth was mine to hold, and it was enough. As the meal carried on with forced small talk and clinking glasses, the weight of his smirk hung in the air. He thought he had won, but inside I was free. And in that freedom was a kind of victory none of them could yet understand. What my father never knew, what no one at that table could have imagined, was that I had been quietly building a life of my own, far beyond the reach of his smirk or his money. For years, while he reminded me of what I wouldn't inherit, I was already creating something that made inheritance irrelevant. He assumed I depended on him, that I was tethered to the family's fortune like a desperate child waiting for scraps. The truth was, I had been free for a long time. It started small. I learned early that if I couldn't rely on his approval, I would have to rely on myself. I worked jobs my siblings thought were beneath them, saved money instead of spending it to impress, and spent nights studying instead of chasing validation. I didn't flash my progress, didn't announce it to the world, because I understood that my silence was my shield. Every dollar I earned was quietly multiplied. Every decision was a brick in the foundation I was laying. While my family was busy competing for my father's attention, I was investing. At first, it was careful steps, modest stocks, safe ventures, calculated risks. Then, as I learned, as I trusted myself, the ventures grew bolder. I poured myself into projects that aligned with what I believed in, and I built businesses that thrived because I had no choice but to make them thrive. Without the safety net of my father's fortune, I created one of my own. Slowly, steadily, the numbers grew. What he never knew was that while he sat at the head of the table, basking in the illusion of control, my net worth had already surpassed his. Not just by a little, but by a margin that made his threats meaningless. He thought his wealth was the crown that made him untouchable. But I had quietly built an empire 10 times the size of his, brick by brick, choice by choice. He had no idea about the properties in my name, the companies that grew from my ideas, the investments that multiplied while he was busy clinging to the past. He had no idea that while he looked at me as the family's weak link, I was the one holding more power than he could imagine. He never asked, never cared enough to see me beyond his assumptions. And in that blindness, he missed the truth. I didn't need anything from him. Not his inheritance, not his validation, not his approval. As he smirked across the table, believing he had diminished me, I sat in silence, knowing that the game had ended long ago. He thought he held the keys to my future, but I had already built a life he could never give and a fortune he could never take away. The only inheritance I ever needed was the discipline born from his rejection, and that had made me unstoppable. I learned early on that if I wanted a life of my own, I couldn't depend on the family name. My father made sure of that. Every time I reached for something, he reminded me it wasn't mine. Every time I made a mistake, he reminded me it was proof I would never measure up. And so I made a choice. I would not beg for what he dangled over me like a prize. I would build a life that was mine alone, even if it meant starting from nothing. It wasn't easy. While my siblings leaned on his connections, walking into jobs handed to them through favors and introductions, I had to carve my own way. I worked part-time through school, juggling shifts and classes, often collapsing into bed with exhaustion. There were moments when my bank account balance was so low I had to decide between paying rent or buying groceries. Nights when I wondered if he was right, if maybe I wasn't capable of more. But something inside me refused to give in. If I had accepted his version of me, I would have been trapped forever. The road to independence was paved with failures. I started a small business that collapsed within a year, wiping out my savings. I invested in projects that didn't pan out, learning painful lessons in risk and discipline. I faced rejection after rejection when I applied for opportunities, doors closing in my face while my siblings bragged about theirs opening without effort. Every failure stung, but each one carved out a deeper determination in me. I realized that every mistake was still mine, and that mattered more than any victory handed to me on a silver platter. I refused to be a spectator in my own life. I studied obsessively, read everything I could about business, investing, leadership. I asked questions, sought mentors, and learned to listen more than I spoke. I worked jobs that felt humbling, sometimes humiliating, but each one taught me something useful. I learned discipline from scarcity, patience from rejection, and resilience from humiliation. While my siblings floated comfortably on my father's fortune, I was forging armor out of every bruise. And slowly, the tide began to turn. I paid off debts. I started saving again. This time, instead of chasing quick wins, I thought long-term. I taught myself to see opportunities others dismissed. Each small success was built on the ashes of a failure, and each one felt earned in a way my siblings would never understand. By the time I reached stability, I knew there was no going back. I didn't want his money, his inheritance, or his validation anymore. I had built something stronger: independence. That was the gift no one could take from me. The long road was brutal, yes, but it taught me a truth my father never wanted me to know. His wealth was a cage, and the only way to truly live was to walk out of it and build my own. Silence became my greatest teacher. For years I sat through dinners and conversations where my words were dismissed before I even finished speaking. My ideas were waved away, my efforts belittled, my presence treated as an afterthought. At first, I fought to be heard. I raised my voice, argued, tried to prove myself in the heat of the moment. But every attempt only fed my father's smug certainty that I was desperate for approval. Eventually, I learned the power of restraint. I stopped trying to convince him or anyone else of my worth. I let them underestimate me. I let them believe I was quiet because I had nothing to say. What they never understood was that I was listening. While they filled the air with boasts and shallow victories, I studied the patterns. I learned how people revealed themselves when they thought you posed no threat. I learned how arrogance blinds people to what's happening right in front of them. Staying silent gave me time to build in secret. I poured my energy into my work, into learning, into creating a future they couldn't imagine for me. Each time I was overlooked, I added it to the fire that kept me moving forward. Each smirk from my father, each careless dismissal from my siblings became fuel. They thought silence meant weakness. In truth, it was strategy. Over time, I came to prefer the shadows. There was a freedom in being underestimated. No one interfered with my plans because they didn't think I had any. No one tried to control my path because they believed I was too far behind to ever matter. Their lack of attention became my shield. And behind it, I was free to grow without interference. I discovered that patience is its own kind of power. While they chased quick victories and shallow recognition, I was playing a longer game. I didn't need applause for every step I took. I didn't need to wave proof in anyone's face. I learned to let results speak louder than any argument ever could. I carried my progress quietly, like a secret weapon waiting for its moment. And when the moment finally came, when I looked across the dinner table and heard my father smirk those words about not getting anything, the silence I gave him wasn't defeat. It was the echo of years of practice. It was the steady calm of someone who no longer needed validation, because the truth was already written in the life I had built. My silence carried more weight than any defense could, because it was backed by something undeniable. Success he knew nothing about. I learned that you don't always have to shout to prove your strength. Sometimes the most powerful statement you can make is to let the world underestimate you, and then let your actions reveal what your words never needed to. My father thought my silence was submission. He never realized it was the sound of power in reserve. I built my life in the shadows, piece by piece, without ever announcing my moves. While my family measured worth in public displays, cars, vacations, the constant flaunting of privilege, I was quietly constructing something far more enduring. I didn't want their applause. I wanted freedom. So I kept my head down, stayed silent, and built. The early days were all grind. I took on side jobs, freelance work, anything that would bring in extra income beyond what paid the bills. It wasn't glamorous. I remember sitting at a small kitchen table late at night, spreadsheets glowing on my laptop, exhaustion pressing on my shoulders, but determination keeping me awake. Every dollar I saved, I reinvested. Every mistake I made became a lesson I carried forward. The first breakthrough came when one of my early investments doubled unexpectedly. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to prove to myself that I wasn't crazy for believing in a future beyond what my father allowed me to imagine. I remember staring at the numbers on the screen, heart racing, tears stinging my eyes, because it was the first tangible evidence that my plan was working. That win didn't just grow my bank account, it grew my confidence. From there, the momentum built. I researched obsessively, learned the rhythms of markets, and began to recognize opportunities others overlooked. I launched a small business that started as nothing more than an experiment, something no one in my family would have taken seriously. Within a year, it was generating steady profit. Within 3, I had expanded it into something that demanded recognition, though I still gave it none at the dinner table. That was the beauty of my path. Nobody knew. My siblings bragged about new purchases, my father lectured about his supposed wisdom, and I said nothing. I let them believe I was still struggling, still the one left behind. In reality, I was buying properties under my name, signing deals they couldn't dream of, and reinvesting everything into ventures that multiplied behind closed doors. The moment it truly turned around was the day I realized my net worth had surpassed my father's. I remember sitting alone in my apartment, running the numbers 3 times just to be sure. It wasn't even close. My fortune was larger, cleaner, and built entirely without him. In that moment, I felt something shift inside me. The cage I had grown up in, built from his comparisons and dismissals, shattered. I was free in a way money alone couldn't explain, yet even then, I told no one. My wealth was not a weapon to wave at the family table, not yet. I didn't need their validation. I carried it like a secret crown, invisible to everyone but me. They saw silence and assumed weakness. They didn't realize that in the shadows, I had become something they could never dismiss again. And when the time came, the truth would be undeniable. There was a time when my father's wealth felt like a mountain I could never climb. As a child, it defined everything: where we lived, how people treated us, even the weight of his words. He wore his money like armor, a reminder that he was untouchable, and that without him, I was nothing. For years, I believed that mountain was permanent, that I would always live at its base while he stood at the peak, looking down with that smug satisfaction. What he never realized was that while he believed I was standing still, I had been climbing a different mountain altogether. The numbers told the story better than anything else. I kept track quietly, year after year, watching my accounts grow from hundreds to thousands, from thousands to millions. The day came when my balance sheet didn't just equal his, it dwarfed it. I ran the calculations over and over, not because I doubted, but because I wanted to savor the reality. 10 times. My net worth was 10 times his. The same man who had sneered at me, who had mocked me for being the least capable, the least deserving, was now smaller in every way that mattered to him. It wasn't luck. It was years of persistence, discipline, and a refusal to let his rejection define me. Each investment, each business, each risk I took was a brick in the foundation of something larger than his shadow. Where he saw control through money, I saw freedom. Where he used wealth as a weapon, I used it as a tool. And while he clung to his status like a lifeline, I was building something that didn't just equal it, it multiplied it. I didn't flaunt it. No flashy cars parked in the driveway of family gatherings, no dramatic announcements at holiday dinners. I let them keep their illusions because their blindness was part of my freedom. They thought I was the forgotten child, the one destined to be cut off. They whispered about me with pity, not knowing I could have bought and sold everything they valued 10 times over. That secrecy was my shield and my satisfaction. The reversal of power was complete, though I never needed to say it aloud. The man who had built his identity on control would never understand that he had lost it long ago. His words no longer held weight, his inheritance no longer tempted me, his approval no longer mattered. The scales had tipped so drastically that the balance of power was unrecognizable. And the most delicious irony was that he still believed he had the upper hand. I laughed inside every time I remembered his smirk, the certainty in his voice when he told me I would get nothing. He was right, in a way. I got nothing from him. And yet, by carving my own path, I gained everything. The mountain that once looked impossible was not only climbed, it was left far behind. Now I stood on a peak 10 times higher, and he would never know how small he had become in comparison. I sat at the table, the same one where I had endured a lifetime of comparisons, dismissals, and cutting remarks. The chandelier overhead still glittered, the silverware still clinked against fine china. But I was no longer the same person who once shrank under those lights. My father thought his smirk had ended the conversation, that his words had settled my fate. "You're not getting anything." He leaned back with the smugness of a man who believed he had just won. But instead of shrinking, I laughed. It wasn't a cruel laugh, not the kind meant to mock or belittle. It was quiet, almost to myself, the sound of something breaking open inside me. For years I had fought to prove myself at this very table. I had wanted him to see me, to acknowledge me, to grant me even the smallest shred of approval. But in that moment, I realized I no longer needed it. His inheritance, his validation, his power, it had no hold over me. My laughter was freedom made audible. The others noticed. My brother shifted in his chair, confused by the sound. He was used to my silence, to me swallowing my pain in the name of peace. My sister glanced at me sharply, sensing something she couldn't quite name. Even my mother, whose eyes had long ago learned to look down at her plate, risked a glance at me as if to ask what I found so funny. My father's smirk faltered for the briefest second. He wasn't used to seeing me react this way. He expected wounded silence, the kind he could feed on. Instead, I met his gaze calmly, no trace of bitterness, no fire to fight back, just that small knowing smile. And though I said nothing, the truth hung between us. He could strip me of his inheritance, but he couldn't strip me of what I had already built. For the first time in my life, I felt no need to defend myself, no need to argue that I was capable, no need to list accomplishments he had never cared about anyway. The battle for recognition was over, and I had won, not by beating him at his game, but by leaving it all together. I didn't need a seat at his table anymore. I sat there by choice, not necessity. That was the difference. The balance of power had shifted so quietly that none of them realized it. To them, I was still the overlooked child, the one excluded from the future my father controlled. But the truth was, I had surpassed them all. The fortune I had built, the freedom I had carved, made his words irrelevant. His smirk was an echo of a power he no longer had, and my laughter was the sound of that illusion collapsing. The dinner carried on awkwardly, the conversation forced, but I barely heard it. I sat in peace, a quiet knowing in my chest. I didn't need to announce my victory. The freedom I carried was enough. My father thought he had the last word, but the truth was, I had already moved beyond his reach. The shift didn't happen all at once. It began with small cracks in the image they had built of me, cracks they couldn't ignore no matter how hard they tried. My brother was the first to notice. He had always prided himself on being the heir apparent, the one who would carry my father's legacy. But when details slipped, an offhand comment about a property I owned, the ease with which I covered an expense without hesitation, I saw it in his eyes. That flicker of confusion, the quick calculation that didn't add up. For years he had believed I lived in his shadow, yet suddenly the light revealed I had been standing in a place he couldn't reach. My sister's reaction came next. She was the master of charm, always favored, always assured of her place. She had built her identity on being untouchable in my father's eyes. But charm only worked when people needed something from the one holding the power. And when she realized I needed nothing, not his approval, not his money, not even his acknowledgement, her confidence faltered. I watched her mask crack as she pieced together the truth, her forced laughter ringing hollow as she tried to dismiss the unease creeping in. My mother said nothing as usual, but her silence was different this time. There was no trembling in her hands, no nervous glance downward. She studied me quietly, her gaze soft but sharp, as if she had always suspected I was building something beyond their reach, but had never dared to believe it fully. Her silence carried a weight that told me she understood, perhaps better than anyone else at that table, that the power dynamic had changed. And then there was my father, the man who built his life on control, who wielded his wealth like a sword, who believed he could define my worth with a smirk and a single sentence. At first, he ignored the signs, clinging to his illusion. But denial only lasts so long when reality refuses to play along. The way I carried myself, the calmness in my laugh, the quiet confidence in my silence, it unsettled him. He tried to meet my eyes with that same smirk, but it faltered. His certainty cracked. For the first time, he looked at me, not with dismissal, but with the unease of a man who realizes the ground beneath him has shifted. The table felt heavy with unspoken questions. My siblings exchanged glances, waiting for me to explain, to justify, to break the tension. But I didn't. I let the silence speak for me. The truth was seeping in, undeniable and irreversible. The one they had dismissed, belittled, and cast aside was not dependent on them at all. I was freer, stronger, and wealthier than any of them had imagined. Shock, denial, confusion, they all played across their faces in waves. And as they sat there grappling with the new reality, I didn't need to gloat. The truth was already loud enough. They finally saw me, not as the forgotten child, but as the one who had quietly rewritten the story while they weren't looking. Inheritance was always treated like a crown in my family, something to be passed down with ceremony and weight, as though it carried not just money, but meaning. My father used it like a weapon, a constant reminder that everything we had came from him and that one day he would decide who was worthy of carrying it forward. For so long, I believed that crown was real, that my future rested in his hands. But somewhere along the way, I learned that inheritance is not about what someone else gives you. It's about what you create for yourself, what you choose to carry, and what you choose to leave behind. For me, the real inheritance wasn't locked in bank accounts or written into wills. It was carved out of struggle, born from rejection, and shaped by the discipline I had no choice but to cultivate. My father thought he was punishing me by withholding his wealth. But in truth, he gave me the greatest gift, the drive to create my own. Every time he dismissed me, I learned to validate myself. Every time he smirked at my failures, I learned to try again. And every time he made me feel like I wasn't enough, I built another layer of resilience that no check could buy. I inherited independence. That was the first and most powerful treasure I ever claimed. While my siblings learned to lean on his fortune, I learned to stand without it. I built habits, skills, and courage that carried me through storms they couldn't have weathered. Independence became my anchor, my proof that no matter what happened, I would never be at the mercy of another person's generosity or cruelty. I inherited self-worth. For years I thought my value was measured by how much love or approval I could win from him, but walking away from that game taught me differently. Self-worth isn't handed to you in a smile or in a line of a will. It comes from knowing that who you are and what you've built cannot be taken away. It is earned in the quiet hours when no one is watching, in the resilience you summon when the world tells you no, in the life you create without applause. And perhaps most important of all, I inherited the power to define my own legacy. My father believed legacy meant control, leaving behind a fortune with his name attached, forcing his children to carry the story he chose for them. But I know better now. Legacy is not control. It is freedom. It is creating something that outlives fear, something that carries forward not just money, but meaning. My legacy will not be a smirk at a dinner table or a cruel reminder of who didn't measure up. It will be proof that worth is not given, it is claimed. Inheritance, as I've come to understand it, is not a gift you wait to receive. It is the life you choose to build when no one is willing to give you anything at all, not. Freedom didn't arrive in a single dramatic moment. It crept in slowly, so quietly, that I almost didn't recognize it at first. For years, I had carried the weight of wanting my father to see me, to acknowledge me, to admit that I was worth something. Every achievement, every milestone, part of me longed to place it in front of him like an offering, hoping for a nod, a word, anything that resembled pride. But pride never came. Approval never came. And one day, I realized I didn't need it anymore. The release was like exhaling after holding my breath for years. His words no longer defined me. His silence no longer stung. That smirk across the dinner table, the one that had once haunted me, now rolled off me like water. It wasn't because I had more money than him, though that irony still tasted sweet. It was because I no longer needed him to tell me who I was. The power he held was never really in the inheritance. It was in my hunger for his validation. And when I let that hunger die, I set myself free. Wealth, I came to understand, isn't just numbers on a balance sheet. It's the ability to stand in your truth without flinching. It's the peace of knowing you no longer have to perform for someone else's approval. My financial freedom gave me choices, yes, but my emotional freedom gave me life. I could sit at the table, hear his cutting remarks, and smile, not out of spite, but out of genuine calm. I no longer needed to argue. I no longer needed to defend. I no longer needed to prove. That, more than anything in my bank accounts, was real wealth. My siblings still orbit his approval like moths around a flame. They cling to his praise, afraid of losing the inheritance that binds them to him. They measure their value by his fleeting smiles, his occasional nods, and they live in constant fear of falling short. Watching them now, I feel no envy, no bitterness, only gratitude that I escaped the trap. My freedom came the moment I realized that the life I built outside his control was worth more than any approval he could offer. Freedom beyond approval means I can live without fear of losing what was never mine. I don't worry about being cut off, because there is nothing he can cut me off from. I don't need a place in his legacy, because I've built my own. My laughter at the table that night was not arrogance. It was the sound of chains breaking, the sound of a woman who had finally learned that the only validation that matters is the kind you give yourself. True wealth isn't inherited. It's claimed in the moment you stop chasing what others refuse to give and start living as though you've already earned it. That's what freedom feels like: light, expansive, untouchable. And I would never trade it for all the approval in the world. Victory doesn't always look like fireworks or grand announcements. Sometimes it's as quiet as a smile across a dinner table, as steady as a heartbeat that no longer races under the weight of someone else's judgment. That night, when my father smirked and told me I wasn't getting anything, my laughter wasn't meant to wound him. It wasn't meant to prove a point to my siblings or demand recognition from anyone in that room. It was the sound of freedom. It was the recognition that I had already won a game he didn't even know I was playing. For so long, I thought victory would mean standing up to him, forcing him to acknowledge my worth, or finally being included in the legacy he guarded so jealously. But I learned that real victory requires none of that. I didn't need to fight for scraps from his table, because I had built a feast of my own. I didn't need to flaunt my success to prove I had surpassed him, because the truth was unshakable, whether he saw it or not. My life, my freedom, my wealth, they spoke louder than any words I could have offered. I didn't leave that dinner triumphant in the way people imagine, with a dramatic revelation or a confrontation that silenced the room. I left quietly, calmly, knowing that I was untouchable. His words, his smirk, his dismissals, none of them had power anymore. The inheritance he clung to as a weapon was meaningless in the face of what I had already created. He could keep it. I didn't need it. That realization was victory in its purest form. What my family never understood was that I wasn't trying to win their approval, their favor, or even their acknowledgement. The only person I had been trying to prove anything to was myself. And I had done it. I had built something bigger than money, independence. I had created something freer than legacy, choice. I had become someone untouchable, not because of the size of my fortune, but because my worth no longer hinged on anyone else's opinion. As I walked away from that dinner, I carried no bitterness, only peace. Let them cling to titles, to inheritance, to the illusion of control. I no longer lived in that world. My victory was knowing that while they measured themselves by what was handed down, I had defined myself by what I had built with my own 2 hands. And that was something no smirk, no cruel word, no dismissal could ever take from me. The quiet victory is the sweetest of all. It doesn't shout, it doesn't gloat, it doesn't beg to be seen. It simply exists, steady and undeniable. That night, my laughter was not disrespect. It was recognition. The moment I realized I didn't just survive his rejection, I had turned it into the very fuel that made me unstoppable. And in that recognition, I knew I had already won. Did you enjoy the story? If so, please let me know in the comments. Also, subscribe to support us. Thanks for watching.